Thank you so much. Let's see, can we move these this way, perhaps? Does that work? Okay. So yesterday evening, Janet Levin was talking about the solar system. In the course of discussing these vastly grander units of cosmic space and time, she mentioned our little solar system and mentioned that it has 8 or 9 planets. So when people my age grew up, of course, we knew there were 8 planets ending in Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. And then in 2006, the International Astronomical Convention decided that Pluto was no longer a planet. Many of you may remember that. And it was quite amazing. I remember that Science Friday program on NPR, where Ira Flato was like, I couldn't see him, of course, because it was radio, but it's like he was holding his head in anguish that Pluto disappeared. Pluto isn't a planet anymore. And I just thought that was so hilarious because, of course, Pluto is still there. Somebody decided, well, now let's call it something else other than a planet. And everybody's going nuts, okay? And that was funny. What's not as funny is Vladimir Putin deciding that Ukraine is not a country. And of course, it's still there, but what's the map? What's the territory? When the Ukraine war began to happen, I immediately thought about Tibet, of course, because Tibet was swallowed by China. Gradually, the swallowing began in 1950 and it completed in 1959. But it's actually continuing today, where Tibetan people in Tibet are now no longer allowed to teach the Tibetan language, and intermarriage is encouraged and that sort of thing. So there's been this gradual process of erasing Tibet over the last 70 years. So what's in a name? My friend and teacher, Gregory Bateson, was fond of saying, stamp out nouns. And he actually got this from another student and friend of his named Anatole Holt, who said he wanted a bumper sticker that said stamp out nouns, that said help stamp out nouns. And so Gregory began repeating that, but Tully Holt was sort of mirroring back to Gregory's own ideas. So who's the author of that statement? Nobody knows. If you start asking who's the author of almost any statement we know, actually nobody knows. But Gregory liked to say stamp out nouns. And the first time he said this to me, I was 21 and he was 68, and we were having dinner in a Mexican restaurant in Soquel, California, which is a little beach community outside of Santa Cruz. And Gregory was 6'5", stooped over. He was enormous. And he was this enormous, shaggy man looming over me across the table with a beer in his hand, a Dos Equis. And he said, stamp out nouns. What do you mean, Gregory? Well, there is no substance. And he gave me this big grin. And of course, the big grin, here he is, this substantial big person and the beer and everything. So, of course, as philosophers always like to knock on desks and say, this is real, So there is substance. But what we call it and how what we call it affects our minds and therefore affects our subsequent actions, and may, in the case of Tibet or Ukraine, affect life and death of millions of human beings, is really very serious. And it's not a quote merely philosophical question. And of course, Stamp Out Nouns mirrors statements made by Korzybski. It mirrors statements made by Benjamin Lee Whorf and by other thinkers that you can all think of. And all of those thinkers were scooped by a matter of 2,000 years by Nagarjuna, who lived approximately somewhere between the 2nd century before the current era or the 2nd century after the current era, who created, somebody last night asked a question of Jana about shunyata, emptiness, the Buddhist idea of emptiness. Yes, you did. And Nagarjuna created the Madhyamaka Prasangika, the fundamental path of the middle way, which gets translated, these ideas get translated into English, especially in the first part of the 20th century, as emptiness or voidness or something like that. And of course, we Westerners like freak out when we encounter that subject, because it sounds like the Buddhists are saying that, you know, that this doesn't exist, or it's all some vague illusion or something like that. But actually, the statement is that things are empty of inherent existence. And the key word for us is inherent. So, knocking again on our little podium here, which is made of wood, what's present in the wood is rain, clouds, water, soil. Soil, of course, is the confluence of millions and billions of organisms that have consumed various minerals and turned it into something else, and it becomes mycelium, and it becomes tree, and then somebody cut the tree down, and they were paid by somebody else, and who was that somebody else? And somebody trucked the tree to a sawmill, and it was sawn into boards, and those people were paid by somebody, and somebody varnished it, and the varnish came from other trees combined with various petrochemicals, and you know the story. So the tree, this podium here, is the is full of stories. It's full of an uncountable amount of stories, going all the way back to the Big Bang. But just here on Earth, where did these substances come from? Who made them? What were their labor relations? What were their struggles in their life? This podium is not going to last forever, and it will eventually become debris in some way which we can't anticipate, but we can, maybe imagine 5 or 6 futures for it. And these molecules will go somewhere else and become something else. So it's hard and real, but it's impermanent. It is full of millions of stories. The one thing it is empty of is an inherent existence all by itself as a self-contained object. So it's empty of inherent existence. It's full of those millions and billions of stories. So Thich Nhat Hanh, the great Buddhist monk, poet, teacher of the 20th and early 21st centuries, used the word interbeing. So the podium inter is my body, which is doesn't contain any molecules that it contained 7 years ago. And 7 years from now, all these molecules will have dispersed elsewhere. I'm empty of inherent existence, and yet I have a pattern and a form, or I am a pattern and a form, which is constantly changing, but you can still, knock on me and get a sound and that sort of thing. So it's really great to stamp out nouns. It's really great to stamp on nouns, because then it becomes a kind of dance that you can do. Okay. In the Western tradition, we have the second commandment, not the second amendment, but the second commandment. And the second commandment is the one that says, "Thou shalt not make graven images of God." Okay. And what that actually says is the image isn't God, that those people who worship the image are just worshiping a statue. Uh, it got degraded in the way language always gets degraded to mean that thou shalt not make sculptures. And so for 2,000 years, there were no Jewish or Arab sculptors. Okay. But it says the same thing as, for example, in the Tao Te Ching, the Tao that can be told, the Tao that can be talked about is not the Tao. So here we are. In the 21st century, we have been absolutely inundated by this rolling progress of fascism. And what is this really about? I mean, we had a wonderful presentation earlier today about same-sex marriage and the dimensions of that. But there's so many dimensions of gender. There's so many kinds of gender, that the marriage of Pete Buttigieg is one way that's valid for those two people. But other kinds of gender uh, manifestations or expressions of gender, there's millions of them that are valid for different people. There are millions of manifestations of so-called race, whatever that is. And yet there are people who are desperate for the categories. It's really, really important to say, okay, this is my gender, that's the other gender, this is the borderline of my country, you can't come in. This is my profession, you can't come in. And we become obsessed with nouns. We become obsessed with the illusion that there are things. And so the dance of stamping out nouns, yes, we can use them in speech, and that's fun, and they have wonderful rhythm when you use them, but you have to be continually dancing on them and squishing them. And there's so much more to say about this, but we'll say it another day. And thank you.